Alright everyone, what is going on, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be talking about ethanol, and I thought this was a relatively good topic to talk about since we are converting my STI behind me to E85. So what we're going to go over what ethanol is, why do you want ethanol, what are the cons of ethanol, and then what parts do you need to be able to run ethanol. Now there are a lot of cars out there that come straight from the manufacturer that are flex fuel ready, which means you can, well, I mean, we'll get into that here in a minute, but the STI behind me and a lot of your guys' cars do not come flex fuel ready. So I mean, let's get into it and let's start talking about ethanol and why you might want it. Yeah, so we're gonna start this video off by saying what ethanol is and where it comes from. So ethanol is going to be a higher octane fuel alternative to gasoline, but it's not a direct replacement. So ethanol, or E85, is going to be a mixture of 85% of ethanol and 15% of gasoline, but that content is going to change from station to station, seasonality, and the geographic location of where that ethanol came from. Like I said, E85 should be a mixture of 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline, but that is going to vary from station to station, just kind of based on that geography and the seasonality of where that ethanol is coming from. You may see values range anywhere between 53% ethanol up to 85% ethanol, and in some cases you might see a little bit more. You can also buy fuel when it comes to E85 or just ethanol in general. You can also buy E30, which is going to be a 30% mixture of ethanol and 70% gasoline, as well as an E15. Generally, all fuel you're going to be getting is going to be an E10 mixture, so you're going to be having 90% of gasoline and 10% ethanol. Now, the reason they do this is primarily because of emissions, but also ethanol has some really good benefits to the engine that gasoline just doesn't have. So now that we've kind of talked about what ethanol is and where it comes from, let's talk about why you would want to use it. Now, why would you want to run ethanol instead of gasoline if it comes from plants? Well, that's a good question. So ethanol is going to burn a lot cleaner, so you are going to be doing some good for the environment, go you, but that is not the reason that we are all swapping over to E85. Now, the reason that we're all swapping over to E85 is because the fuel burns much cooler than gasoline does. So as a result of the fuel burning cooler, you're going to see a decrease in engine knock, engine pinging, and it's going to make your car a lot happier because you're running a cleaner fuel through it. Now, on top of that, your tuner is going to be able to tune your car a lot more aggressively on E85 than you would on gasoline because of that reduced engine knock and that increase in cooling capabilities from the fuel. Now, you are going to see an energy well, you're not going to see it, but there is an energy difference between gasoline and ethanol, and there's a couple byproducts of what happens from this. So gasoline is going to have a BTU, which stands for British Thermal Units. I was going to convert all these over to joules, but the number was just astronomically larger. So when it comes to BTUs of gasoline, you're going to see a number of about 125,000. Now, when it comes to ethanol, you're going to see ranges of about 84,000 BTU. So you'll see a difference of about 40,000 BTU between gasoline and ethanol. Now, because of this, you are going to have to make up for that lack of energy in the fuel. So you're going to be running more fuel on ethanol than you would on gasoline. So as a result, you are going to see a decrease in your fuel economy, and you're probably going to be making more trips to the gas station. But that is going to be a trade-off of running a more reliable fuel than gasoline. And then ethanol is also going to have a higher octane content than gasoline does. So it's going to have a higher octane content, but it does have a decrease in energy efficiency. So trade-offs, right? But what are some of the cons of running E85? Because there are some cons that you should probably be aware of before you decide to make the switch, if that is what you're considering to do. Like I said, there are going to be some downsides of ethanol as compared to gasoline. Now, if you are in a state like me up here in Washington, we have about 3 E85 stations in the entire state. Luckily, one of them is about 25 minutes away from me, so I am able to stock up on E85 relatively easily. But for some states out there, it's just not very feasible to be able to run E85. So if you are considering swapping your one and only car over to ethanol, but there's no fuel stations around you that stock ethanol, and it's going to be very difficult for you to get some, I would reconsider making the decision to jump over to ethanol. So just something to keep in mind if you are considering. Make sure that you have fuel stations around you that do support ethanol and that you are able to access it. Now, like we said, ethanol does have a higher octane rating than fuel does. Now, as a byproduct of that, ethanol is going to be a stronger solvent than gasoline will, which can result in some interesting issues inside of your engine bay, your fuel tank, and your fuel lines. So because ethanol is a little more harsh, it can cause corrosion to your fuel lines, to metal, your fuel pump, anything that it is touching that is not going to be supporting that ethanol. So if you are going to be swapping over, just make sure you pay attention here shortly when we start going over all the parts that you need to make sure you can run E85 E85 accordingly. So the last thing I could really come up with as a downside of E85 is that, like we said earlier, ethanol does burn colder than gasoline does. Now, as a byproduct, because ethanol does burn cooler than gasoline does, you are gonna have some pretty rough cold starts if you live in a cold area of the world. So I've seen people run block heaters, I've seen people heat their fuel tanks a little bit, which I am not quite sure how they're doing, but if you do decide to do that, look into it and make sure you stay safe. You don't wanna make a bomb. Don't blow up your car in your garage, you guys. Just don't do that. But because it does burn colder, you are gonna have some pretty rough cold starts. It's also gonna take longer for your O2 sensors to heat up to operating temperature, which means that if you do get the car started, you're gonna see your air-fuel ratios be all over the place until your O2 sensors heat up to operating range, and then they can start making those adjustments in the ECU to tell your fuel and your air what it needs to be doing. So outside of those three downsides, I really don't see a lot of pitfalls of running E85 in your car outside of those. But if I did miss any major ones, please feel free to drop them down below in the comments, so that way everyone else is aware of some of the negatives or the downsides of running ethanol in your car. So now that we've talked about what ethanol is and where it comes from, why you would want to run it and some of the downfalls of it, let's look into the parts that you're going to be needing to be able to run ethanol accordingly and efficiently. Obviously, if you are going to be running ethanol, you are going to need an ethanol sensor. Now, there are some kits out there, especially for Subarus, that are pretty plug and play. If you're outside of the Subaru realm and you're looking at an ethanol sensor, I'll just look around for some good reputable manufacturers, but an ethanol sensor is obviously going to be one of the things that you need. Now, what this does is it reads the ethanol content of the fuel as it goes into the engine, so that way it knows what to set everything to. It sets all the parameters and keeps everything within range, so that way the car doesn't think you're running E90 when you're actually running like E60. So this is a major component, so make sure you are getting a reputable brand when it comes to ethanol sensors. Now, the next thing you are going to need is going to be some injectors. Now, these are OEM STI injectors. I currently have ID 1050s in the car, which are E85 compatible. So the reason you want to make sure you have a good injector is that you're going to need sufficient flow because of that lack of energy density from gasoline over to ethanol. So these are going to be a major critical element of what you're going to be needing. Now, when it comes to size of the injector, you are going to have to do some math to figure out what size injector you need to be able to run ethanol efficiently for the power goals that you're shooting for, if you are shooting for power. But injectors, one of the big ones you don't want to miss. You're also going to need a fuel pump. So once again, this is an OEM STI fuel pump. I currently have a DW300C in the car, which is E85 compatible. Now, the reason you're going to want a fuel pump is you are going to want stronger flow coming out of that fuel tank to make up for that lack of energy. You're going to need more fuel. So you're going to need a stronger fuel pump to be able to pump the correct amount of fuel up to the injectors. Now, you're also going to want to make sure you get an E85 compatible one because, like we said, E85 is a stronger solvent. So if you are getting a fuel pump that is not, this section of the fuel pump itself can start corroding, and then you're getting rust in your fuel. You're sucking up rust into your fuel filter. It's going up to your injectors, and you just don't want that. So make sure you are getting an E85 compatible fuel pump, so that way you are not destroying any critical engine components with a rust particulate as it travels up through. Now, here's another tiny one for you guys. You're going to want a fuel pressure sensor. This is going to allow your tuner to see what the exact fuel pressure is as it's happening. So if you do have an aftermarket ECU or you are running the OE ECU, you should have a fuel pressure sensor installed. These are pretty cheap. These are about $200. Make sure you get a fuel pressure sensor so that way your tuner doesn't hate you and he can actually tune your car. So fuel pressure sensor also required. Not a bad item to scoop up either. All right, here's a fun one. Looks like a snake noodle of a whole bunch of things. So this is the OEM STI fuel pressure regulator. So this wasn't even sufficient for normal fuel flow for gasoline. So when you are swapping over to ethanol, you are going to want a fuel pressure regulator that you can adjust, so that way you can set fuel pressure to whatever you need to. Now, if you are a Subaru person, you are using some off-the-shelf stuff. Cobb makes some pretty good plug and play fuel pressure regulator stuff. I'm going to be running my own custom setup, but if you do need one that's just plug and play, I would check out Cobb's. Just make sure you are getting the OEM fuel pressure regulator out of the car, because as you can see, this is completely inefficient and doesn't make much sense. So swap out this garbage also. So although not required, highly suggested, I would say get some fuel rails, because you are going to be increasing the amount of flow of fuel going up and the capacity of the fuel going up to the injectors. You are going to want some bigger fuel rails, so that way you're able to flow the correct amount of fuel up into the engine and not starve your engine of fuel, because that would be bad, and we don't want anyone to blow up their engines. So the last thing that you're going to need to be able to run ethanol is fuel lines. Now, I am going to be making my own fuel lines out of Vibrant hose, but like we talked about earlier, E85 can be pretty corrosive, and we don't want it to destroy anyone's fuel lines, cause fuel leaks, and destroy anything. So just make sure you're getting some good line that can handle the resistance and the corrosion of ethanol up in the engine bay. Now that's pretty much going to be everything that we need. Now, if I did miss anything, please feel free to drop it down below in the comments, so that way everyone else can be kind of aware of everything that they need. But this should be all the critical elements of everything that you're going to be needing to be able to run ethanol in your car. I mean, lastly, you are also going to need a tune, but outside of having a tune, that should already be a given. So parts-wise, this should be all you need. All right, you guys, so that is going to cover it for the E85 and ethanol stuff as an introductory kind of informational session before we start doing all that stuff over to the STI, just to give you guys a little more clarity and background of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So if this video helped you guys out, or you just generally enjoyed the content, you know what to do. Go ahead and smash that like button, turn it blue like the Subaru behind me. Ooh. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to be, let's go ahead and do this top, my right, your left corner tonight. And with that, I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, homies. Woo!